what if the prior committee was invalid? It didn't follow House rules. You can just do that, or maybe that should be against the House rules.
Breaking news, Steve Bannon denied his request for the so-called Club Fed when he's forced to report to prison. Sources telling CNN that the longtime Trump ally will not get a cushy prison assignment, but is likely to serve time in a Connecticut prison where he could be placed with violent criminals and sex offenders.
Let's not make any mistake here. Steve Bannon knows exactly what he's doing. He is riling up a violent base that is the same base that invaded the Capitol, and he is saying victory or death.
Congress now has some momentum fighting to reverse a lot of Liz Cheney's J6 shenanigans because it was illegal in the first place. Illegally constituted under H.R. 503, they created a fake committee that didn't even comport with their own rules. And now they've issued a bunch of subpoenas. Of course, people that we've covered here like Peter Navarro is already in prison, and Steve Bannon they're attempting to send to prison. And so the question is, what can this Congress do since this Congress is not in control of Liz Cheney and Nancy Pelosi? It's now in control of the Republicans, supposedly. So we'll go through and see what they can do. One person has a solution in mind. It's Representative Eric Burlison, who has a bill to reverse the subpoenas that Bannon got, maybe freeing him from the illegal prosecution, from the illegal H.R. 503 J6 committee. We'll have reaction because the Democrats really want him in jail, maybe so something bad can happen. And we'll take a look at Bannon's actual written appeals and his reply to the government's opposition here in a second. But first, this is curious. Representative Eric Burlison is the person who wrote this tweet. He says, as a representative from Missouri, talking about the illegal J6 committee, he says, next week, I'm introducing, that's this week, a resolution to rescind the subpoenas issued by the illegitimate, so thank you for saying that, J6 committee for Steve Bannon, Mark Meadows, Dan Scavino, and Peter Navarro, and to withdraw the recommendations finding them in contempt of Congress. Sounds great. And I have not heard a lot of this language from many Republicans, so I'm very grateful to hear that because many of them just presume it is legitimate. They just, well, Congress acted and the DOJ. If a process happens in front of them, they don't question it at all. They just get a result. It's like they get a ticket from a police officer. They say, wow, it's great. I must have been completely doing exactly what you said. Thank you. And a lot of Republicans are like that. What are you talking about? The DOJ return an indictment and you think it's legitimate for some stupid reason because Liz Cheney was involved? What? So he calls it illegitimate because it is. They're literally in violation of their own rules. But when they brought it up in court, what did the court say? The DC court said, we can't regulate Congress. There's a separation of powers problem. So if Congress wants to conduct their own illegitimate procedures, they're free to do that, essentially. And the Republicans didn't do anything in Congress. And so Pelosi just got her way, as she usually does. So he continues. He says, the committee was nothing more than a political witch hunt to blame President Trump and his advisors for the events that took place on January 6th, which were instigated by the feds and allowed to happen by Nancy Pelosi and the House Sergeant at Arms. Ask Stephen Sund about it. His advisors for the events that took place on J6 and to influence the 2022 midterms. And honestly, they tried to impeach him for that too. And the 2024 presidential election. They wanted to impeach him. They wanted to make sure he could never run for office again. The committee was legally deficient in its composition and was more focused. It was, absolutely. You can read the rules. We've read them here. H.R. 503, the resolution that was passed by the House, said this is what the composition needs to be. They didn't follow those rules. Illegal. The subpoenas issued were insufficient because they were based on an illegal committee and they should be rescinded. And the contempt of Congress referrals based on those subpoenas should be withdrawn. So he says, thank you to the co-sponsors, Andy Biggs, Thomas Massey, Chip Roy, Ogles, Clyde, Gosar from Arizona, Bob Good, Hashberger, Boebert, Clay Higgins, Breachin, Mary Miller, Barry Moore, Luna's in the house, Eli Crane, MTG, Jim Banks, and others. It looks like a bunch of others. Scott Perry, Dan Bishop, and Representative Cloud. What makes it illegitimate? They were illegally constituted. Good question, War Monitor. HR 503 said they had to have 13 members. They didn't. They had 9. It's supposed to be 8 Democrats, 5 Republicans. It wasn't. It was 7 Democrats, 2 Republicans. It's a representative body. It's supposed to be representative. The minority party did not have an opportunity to appoint or nominate any Republicans, not a single one. In fact, who they did nominate were rejected by Nancy Pelosi, and she shoved in Kinzinger and Cheney and called those Republicans. So it wasn't legitimate at all. Thankfully, Eric Burlison is doing something about it. And this is Marjorie Taylor Greene also supporting him, saying, all right, you know, I fully support as well, and I'm co-sponsoring this resolution to rescind the subpoenas for Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro by repudiating Pelosi's illegitimate J6 committee. Says Nancy Pelosi violated House rules by refusing to accept McCarthy's appointed Republicans on the committee. Now our Republican-led House must nullify any actions taken by them because they're illegitimate. So you're going to hear a bunch of people on the left saying, no, they were perfectly illegitimate. Congress is over. It's closed. Game over. So there's finality to the subpoenas. In other words, this next Congress cannot do this. But what if the prior committee was invalid? It didn't follow House rules. You can just do that, or maybe that should be against the House rules. So we must also hold the J6 committee members accountable. That's absolutely right. They destroyed evidence in violation of House rules and the committee records. House Republicans need to start taking action. I hope they do. And I agree completely. Now, I don't know if that destruction of records will be something that's protected by legislative privilege or something like that, but you could make the argument that those documents were no longer theirs. They should be transferred over to the next Congress. So they had no right to destroy them at all. It's not their jurisdiction, in other words. It's the jurisdiction of the incoming Congress. So interesting. Now, I do think that there should be wide-ranging investigation for these people. This was a conspiracy. In my opinion, they created a lot of this. We know that in the Proud Boys trial, there were 50 identified government agents in the crowd, not only from the FBI, but also, which they admitted, they stipulated to that in the trial, but there were also Homeland Security agents that were also infesting the entire arena as well. And they were shooting people in the face with projectiles, blowing holes in their cheeks before there was anything going on to instigate a reaction from the crowd. And then they caused it to happen. And people like Ray Epps got away with it, even though he was at the first breach instigating the whole thing. So that is what the Congress is up to. Let's take a look at how the bill reads. This is what it would look like in Congress, submitted here. HRes, this will be filled in eventually, but it tells us this is a resolution that would rescind the subpoenas from Liz Cheney's fake January 6th Select Committee that were issued on September 23rd, October 6th, February 9th, and withdraw the recommendations finding Bannon, Mark Meadows, Dan Scavino, Peter Navarro, all in contempt of Congress. They say on June 30th, Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker of the House of Representatives, established the Select Committee to investigate the J6 attack on the Capitol. Now, they tell us that the committee was deficient in its composition. The resolution that was H.R. 503 that was passed stated, this is the law, okay? Congress passes the laws, and they pass their own resolution. Pelosi had to follow this order. The Speaker shall, see that? Not may, not if she's feeling happy or is drunk or whatever. Pelosi shall appoint 13 members to the Select Committee, 5 of whom shall be appointed after consultation with the minority leader. That was Kev McCarthy. Never happened. Speaker Pelosi refused to seat Republican members. Kevin McCarthy came in and he said, oh no, we're putting Jim Jordan on there, we're putting all these people on. And she said, no, I'm not putting those people on, resulting in a solely partisan exercise determined to vilify President Trump and his advisors for the J6 breach of the Capitol. And I don't know what the Republicans were really doing here. I mean, they were just allowing all of this to happen and just going along with it. Now, whereas Speaker Pelosi refused the selections of McCarthy, named only these 2 fake Republicans, Cheney and Kinzinger, to the committee. And the committee only had 9 people rather than the required 13. Isn't that convenient? And the Republicans, like all the media, just accepted it. It's not even real. They didn't even follow their own rules. And they just played it on TV day after day. It was pure propaganda. It was the shadows on the wall in Plato's cave, and most of the country just ate it up. Now, whereas the Select Committee held hearings, issued subpoenas, and published a flawed report without even the members required by H.R. 503, shortly before the hearings begin, the Select Committee named Cheney as vice chair and operated without a ranking minority member. So there was no ranking minority member. The position of a vice chair is distinct and different from a ranking minority member, is clearly understood in the rules. We all know that. And H.R. 503 also, the rules specifically required the chair of the Select Committee to consult with the ranking minority member in certain circumstances. Never happened because there was no ranking minority member. Now, H.R. 503 included the requirement that the chair of the Select Committee could only issue a subpoena upon consultation with the ranking minority member. But the Democrats failed to draft and pass H.R. 503 in a manner giving the Select Committee chair unilateral authority to issue subpoenas. And so that's what happened. Okay, the Democrats just issued them. So all subpoenas issued by them are legally insufficient. They didn't give them that power in the rules, but everybody just accepted it. Now, Benny Thompson, then chair of the Select Committee, failed to ensure the preservation of the documents as well, deleted evidence, including documents, transcripts, interviews, video recordings of the interviews, all covered up. And the Select Committee also promoted numerous theories, didn't even interview people, and had no actual firsthand knowledge of these allegations. The Select Committee was also a partisan exercise from the very beginning. We already all know that. There was no cross-examination. There was no cross-presentation of evidence at all. For nearly 2 years, the J6 Committee presented their own little book reports. Liz Cheney and her crayons came out, and what happened next? And they just read from the teleprompter on the thing that some other idiot wrote for them. And people started to tune out by episode 7. We're like, again? This is the same story again? His advisors and supporters in an effort to influence future elections, right? It's future rigging. And charges, political prosecution. Now, whereas members of the J6 committee actually withheld and destroyed information that could have provided evidence that Trump did not engage in an insurrection, they deleted it on purpose. And then they imprisoned Peter Navarro, and they're intending to imprison Steve Bannon as well. They're trying to silence and marginalize political opponents and to chill the prospect of other people speaking out. Because if you speak out and you serve in the Trump administration, maybe you go to prison too. And remember, Bannon and Navarro were just invoking Trump's executive privilege. They were doing it on behalf of Trump. They worked for Trump. And so Trump said, no, we have privilege. You can't go talk about all this stuff because I'm the holder of the privilege. And so since all of that has happened, and still many Democrats in here think, no, totally legitimate to run a government this way. No, absolutely makes sense. Rob, HR 503, the House resolution that has these numbers like 13 and 8 and 5, they're just like guideposts. They're just like recommendations. It was legitimate because the Republicans had Liz Cheney on it. It's wild that they can rationalize that in their key brains, but they do. But resolve, they say, all right, it is the sense of the House of Representatives now, this current House, that the select committee to investigate J6 committee was illegitimate by their own rules. That the conclusions and the findings that were presented were predetermined, obviously, due to the committee's partisan nature, and that the courts should set aside any convictions and commute any sentences stemming from contempt reports issued by the select committee. Now, the DOJ will take this recommendation and flush it right down the toilet, right? So Congress would pass this and they would say, it's partisan. So this would go over to Biden's DOJ and they would just dump it in the trash. But this would be very persuasive for Trump's DOJ. He comes in and he says, all right, everything is commuted. This next Congress has found that the first Congress was completely illegitimate, didn't even follow their own rules. It's objective. You can just look at the committee, look at the videos. How many people were on there? Was it 13? No. The subpoenas issued on September 23rd for Bannon, Meadows, Daniel Scavino, Navarro, they're all hereby rescinded if this passes. And of course, this would be, you would ask, well, does this have to pass the Senate too? Well, I don't know. I don't think so, because it's just the House governing itself after all. And the court's already said that the House can kind of govern itself. And if HR 503 passes the House and then Pelosi acts like a lunatic and violates all the rules, so be it. So, okay, just do what they did. HR 730 recommends that Bannon, they find him in contempt, right? So they're going backwards to the prior Congress, recommending that the House of Representatives find that Bannon be held in contempt is hereby withdrawn, dismissed, or otherwise ended and concluded without further proceedings or enforcement. And HR 1037, which held Navarro in contempt and Scavino in contempt, is also withdrawn, dismissed, or ended. HRES finding Mark Meadows in contempt from December 2021 is also hereby dismissed. And we now notify the Department of Justice that the subpoenas are hereby rescinded and shall be considered null and void. So this would cause a problem, right? If this happens, if this passes the House, and it absolutely should. What Republican out there is going to have a problem with this? They have a perfect justification. Even if they don't like Bannon or Navarro or Trump even, just say the House has to follow rules, okay? HR 503 was the rule. We agreed to that. They broke their terms. So that is the base layer. Can you just ask the Democrats to follow the rules? Republicans, like how complicated is this? Or is it just total bedlam in your own body of government? So they should all be passing this. It should pass clearly, unequivocally. Every Republican should sign on to it. It should pass quickly. And then we'd run into a problem with the DOJ. They'd say, nuh-uh, the other Congress already said it was. And so we've already instituted our prosecutions. And of course, the DC courts would probably agree with them. That got submitted. There is support for it. Want to play a couple of these clips before we see what Bannon says about this in his filings. But here was the media just giddy that Bannon might be on the verge of going into custody. And as we've talked about here, this is going, I think, to backfire bigly on them. They're giddy about prosecuting their political opponents. And I think it makes a lot of people's skin crawl to recognize that we're living in a country that is now deviating, descending into this era. So here is CNN.
Breaking news, Steve Bannon denied his request for the so-called Club Fed when he's forced to report to prison. Sources telling CNN that the longtime Trump ally will not get a cushy prison assignment, but is likely to serve time in a Connecticut prison where he could be placed with violent criminals and sex offenders. A prison that does not have individual cells, but rather an open pod layout for inmates. And CNN is learning tonight that there is also a chance Bannon could be sent to New York City's infamous Rikers Island.
Amazing. So they're like really happy about, where's he gonna go? Where's he gonna be? And almost excited. You can see a little bit of glee in her face. And so that is CNN. Now remember that they've told us that if you say bad things about a person, so for example, if Trump says something about a judge's GF who used to work for Chuck Schumer, who hates Donald Trump, who donated against him, all the things, then Trump Trump is intending to cause violence to that person. Okay, when Trump comes out and Trump says the feds wanted me dead because there was a legitimate use of force policy that they incorporated into their raid at Mar-a-Lago, which is all true, then Trump is engaging in stochastic terrorism. He's trying to hurt the feds. He's trying to hurt the FBI agents, right? They cry about it all the time. So now Dan Goldman, I guess, is allowed to do that. So he's going to say that Steve Bannon, who's about to report to prison, Steve Bannon's a private citizen, by the way. He just has a really, really great podcast and show that everybody happens to love, which makes him a big threat to Dan. But Dan is now encouraging, I think, by this language, playing by their own rules, if he's going to talk about what a bad dude Steve Bannon is and how dangerous he is to democracy, is he intending for something bad to happen to Steve Bannon? Are the security cameras also going to fail like they did for Epstein? Are the security guards going to fall asleep and someone's going to come and deal with the insurrectionist who already almost ended American democracy? How is Dan Goldman, the man who bought his congressional seat because he inherited a bunch of money from his Levi Strauss family, what is he? Is he going to be held responsible for this stochastic terrorism?
And joining us now is New York Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. You know, when you listen to Steve Bannon say things like November 5th is Judgment Day,
that's right.
January 20th, 2025 is Accountability Day, and you can write this off as that there goes Steve Bannon again. But after January 6th, you can't really do that. What's your reaction when you hear that?
There's going to be another insurrection.
Remember, Steve Bannon was the one on his podcast the day before January 6th.
Shout out to War Room.
Really rallied the troops, so to speak, to raid the Capitol. And now he's using the same rhetoric. So it's the same as Donald Trump. It's one thing if you do it the first time and you don't necessarily realize what the reaction will be. It's entirely different when you know what the reaction is to your violent rhetoric and you still continue to do it. So let's not make any mistake here. Steve Bannon knows exactly what he's doing. He is riling up a violent base that is the same base that invaded the Capitol, and he is saying victory or death, which means either we win or we kill our opponent.
That's not exactly what that means. It sort of means like you die trying, like you don't have to kill your opponent, you just kind of die trying kind of a thing.
That is the definition of fascism.
Not really.
And it is incredibly scary, Jim, to think that this is what we are facing in this next election. I don't want to talk about policy.
Of course
we
not.
can talk about policy, you know, all day long, but it's irrelevant. What we have is Steve Bannon and Donald Trump trying to destroy the country that we know.
Well, so it feels to me like Dan Goldman should be gagged, like which he might like, but he is wanting to, I guess, silence Steve Bannon because Steve Bannon is an insurrectionist. Now, here is some new filings in the Steve Bannon case. We know we've covered this previously here on this channel that Steve Bannon has submitted an emergency appeal to the circuit court, but now we have two additional filings in response to that. So the way these go, Bannon makes the first motion, government responds with their response, and then Bannon replies. He gets the final say, like the final slice of bread on the sandwich. We've already read through Bannon's first attempt filing. This is the government's response. We'll hit the highlights on this and then see what Bannon says in reply. But this is from the government. Now remember, we're in the District of Columbia. This is not Jack Smith. This is just a regular old DOJ. They say after this court affirmed Bannon's convictions, so Bannon appealed, the court said your appeals are valid. Then the district court said that they lifted the stay of Bannon's sentence. Okay, so the Court of Appeals comes out. Bannon says we're going to appeal it again, but they then lifted the stay. Now Bannon has filed an emergency motion, so he's got to go back into custody. But they say that Bannon fails to show why he should have a reversal or a new trial. They say this court already knows all the facts. All right, January 6th attack happened. The illegal J6 committee issued a subpoena for Bannon, and they say that he might have information about J6. The subpoena listed 17 categories in their fishing expeditions. The vast majority of the topics listed Bannon as a private citizen, and Bannon did not comply with the subpoena. So then they got a letter from Justin Clark, Trump's lawyer, that said Trump was invoking executive privilege. And the committee, Liz Cheney and Benny Thompson, illegally constituted. They rejected, not the courts, the executive privilege claim. It said, no, we haven't gotten it from Trump, and it's not going to excuse you of this. So Bannon insisted that the committee doesn't have subpoena power. But then they learned that he was refusing to comply. They sent him a letter. Bannon still refused to comply. And the court, he was ultimately referred for contempt prosecution. He was charged. They tried him before a jury. He got 4 months prison, and the district court stayed the appeal, the sentence pending the appeal. So he didn't have have to go into custody. Now, this court, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, affirmed Bannon's convictions, rejected his claims that there was no mens rea element because he wasn't intending to violate the law. He thought he was in compliance with the law. He was honoring the executive privilege of Trump. The court said, no, we think that your conviction is warranted, and they say that Bannon should go into custody now. If he wants to get released, well, he has to show that there's clear and convincing evidence that the appeal is going to raise a new question of law or fact. And Bannon's going to respond here in a minute and explain, oh yeah, there's tons of stuff to dig into. They say Bannon argues that the mental state required for contempt requires and presents a substantial question that justifies a rehearing or a rehearing en banc to go to the full Court of Appeals. But he doesn't establish why that is, and they're going to give us a lot of background. So from Bannon's defense, he's now replying, say, oh, no, we've shown plenty already, okay? The DC Circuit Court of Appeals should absolutely hear this claim and stop Bannon from having to go into custody. They tell us, first of all, under the law, Bannon only needs to show that this appeal would present a new substantial legal question that, if accepted, would result in one of two things. So Bannon, what does he have to do? Would likely result in a new trial or less prison time. And so therefore, he's entitled to do that. Saying the various sections of the law require two-part inquiries, and contrary to what the government said here, all circuits have concluded that it's not about committing reversible error. Okay, it's not that high of a standard. It's much lower standard. The statutory standard is lower. Unlike someone seeking a stay pending appeal, Bannon need not show that there is a fair chance that the Supreme Court would actually grant review. That's not the standard. It's lower than that. Now, the mindset, right, the guilty mind issue, it remains a substantial question. This is the mens rea issue. Did Bannon actually knowingly violate the law? No. He thought he was in compliance with the law, honoring Trump's invocation of executive privilege. And if that position is accepted, Bannon would likely be entitled to a new trial. And even if Bannon did need to make a showing that the Supreme Court would be interested in this, he's already done that. This is a big deal. They say the government claims that Bannon can no longer show this and that they've already rejected his arguments. But they say, no, that's not true. The government previously made the opposite argument. And they said that even the OLC memo has never addressed a situation resembling Bannon's. This is a new issue. The novelty here even exists in the OLC opinions. Even they've never seen a situation like this where an outgoing president invokes executive privilege on behalf of a prior administrative official. And second, the panel opinion also stated that the Supreme Court's general rule about interpreting the word willfully, did Bannon willfully violate the law, it would match Bannon's interpretation. In other words, if the Supreme Court simply adheres to its general rule, Bannon must get a new trial, because willfully means like what it sounds like, willfully wanting to violate the law. Bannon had no intention of doing that at all. He was following advice of counsel. Now, the government's only argument to say that Bannon willfully, they just say it means intentionally, right? So he intentionally did the thing. Like, did you move that thing? I intentionally moved the thing. I intentionally took the act, which is you would say could be lower than willfully. But it contradicts their own standards of construction. It's in serious tension with its Supreme Court's own decisions. Now, the court's panel also recognized these other cases, defining what does willfully mean. It's difficult to imagine the court concluding that the mens rea, the mindset requirement, for two different provisions which use starkly different terms are identical. In other words, it'd be weird to say that willfully and intentionally are the same thing, because they're not. They used both different words in two different sections, so they mean different things. Supreme Court has recognized this, and so Bannon is entitled to that argument. Now, to the extent the Supreme Court has already addressed this, Bannon, he's at least demonstrating this is a substantial issue. What is the distinction between the two? We also think there's a good reason that the Supreme Court is going to hear this case eventually. We don't think he does need to prove that, but we think that they will hear it. The Supreme Court has already granted nearly 20 cases on this section of the law, saying the government claims the court hasn't granted one in decades, but that's only because the government stopped pursuing these convictions until Trump came into power. The government resurrected this claim, and there is every reason to believe the court will want to address this anomalous mens rea holding. And so we're waiting for SCOTUS to step in. Now, as also noted, a few Supreme Court cases also favor Bannon. The Supreme Court routinely grants review of lower decisions that are in tension with its own decisions. And third, there's serious concern about politically tinged prosecutions under this law. It's far more of a practical concern, saying that the theory is that the defendants will manufacture a claim of good faith. Now, the government argues it's unlikely there will be such prosecutions when officials actually do invoke executive privilege, but that memo supports Bannon's request because it shows that the OLC will actually defend those prior cases when intentionally comes into play. Now, for all these reasons, there is a strong basis that the entire Court of Appeals, en banc, or the Supreme Court may step in and shut this Pandora's box. So there's a good reason for this appeal to move forward. Now, even if this court considers the odds of further review to be both relevant and low, the court should still allow Bannon to be granted release. Okay, Bannon, no prior criminal convictions that we're aware of, and he served his country. He's not a flight risk, right? He's got an entire business and community and audience here. He's working to fight for this country, worked for the former president. So why would he need to go into custody now all of a sudden, pending appeal? Well, it's so that they can silence him, so that he's not on the air talking to his amazing audience between now and the election. Now, other courts have explained, even though the court considers the likelihood of granting cert, the Supreme Court accepting this case, the court does not relish the prospect of revoking bail and putting him in incarceration only to have the Supreme Court reverse this. And the mens rea error is not harmless. They made a big mistake. They created an enormous error in the mens rea instructions. The government claims that the preclusion of advice of counsel evidence that Bannon was relying on his lawyer. He couldn't even make that argument to say, my lawyer told me I couldn't do that. They say those are not harmless. That position is meritless. Big deal. Which is why the government never raised it during a direct appeal. This court has already held that eliminating the prosecutor's burden of proving mens rea, a guilty mind, is a serious constitutional error. An error cannot be harmless where it prevents the defense for providing an evidentiary basis for his defense. And that's exactly what happened here. The district court in the trial stopped Bannon from presenting a defense at trial. And they instructed the jury consistent with their other rulings, because he got railroaded just like Trump did in DC. It's not any different. The government points to the record, but only the record the jury heard was that Bannon had disregarded the subpoena and he couldn't even talk about his good faith reliance on his lawyer. So Bannon, how could you say that he willfully or intentionally did the thing if you say, my lawyer told me not to? I talked to counsel. They said it's illegal if you do this. You're legally immune from doing this. He followed their advice, couldn't even tell the jurors. Now, the government argues that even if Bannon prevailed on his separate argument about the disputed test for substantial review, it would not likely result in reversal. But if Bannon were in the Ninth Circuit with its lower test, he would remain out on appeal. And by forcing Bannon to instead serve his entire sentence before his appeals are even completed, the government is precluding any opportunity for him to serve less time, and that satisfies the law. And so this court should grant this motion. And by the way, the government argues that Bannon, quote, never raised executive privilege as an affirmative defense. But that's a red herring. It's undisputed that Bannon has argued at every stage of this case that his conduct was not willful. And the reason why it was not willful is because he relied on advice of counsel, who believed that Bannon could not lawfully comply with the subpoena until the executive privilege issue was resolved. So a good filing. This is submitted by Trent McCotter, Boyden Gray, PLLC law firm. And they send that in on behalf of Steve Bannon into the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, we're not optimistic that this is going to go anywhere, but we'll see what their rejection looks like and whether the full court will accept it en banc or whether they'll get rejected and then take this up to the Court of Appeals. Time will tell. So we'll see if Congress does anything about this. Hopefully Mike Johnson takes this up and passes it, since they're in control theoretically. We're going to be here continuing to cover this, my friends. Thank you for subscribing wherever it is you're watching this. We'd love to have you come back here and join us. We cover this type of stuff very regularly and would very much appreciate having you become a member of our community over at watchingthewatchers.locals.com if you want to get some extra members only content. But if you enjoyed this video, we have a great segment coming up next on Hunter Biden and the way that he used his vice president daddy to escape his own criminal problems. We'll see you back over there on the next one.